The good old American Constitution. Some love it, some hate it, and some don't even know what it is. So what's the big idea? Is America's Constitution sacred or sinister? Do we have the supreme system of government, or are we behind the times? Trying to uncover the answers to these questions in today's opinionated world can be like trying to scale a mountain while wearing roller skates. Now that's where I come in. I'll present the straight facts and we can decide together. We'll take a look at some of the key American constitutional principles and take a trip around the globe to see how our system of government stacks up. First off, what best protects citizens' rights? Let's take a look at America's founding document. When most people think of the American Constitution, they probably picture old men in wigs. But after that, they usually think of the Bill of Rights, one of America's most popular aspects of the Constitution. As Americans, we know that this document protects many of our individual rights by law. So how does our protection of individual freedom stack up against other countries? Let's take a trip around the world. First up, Australia. This country is usually thought of as a modern and well-governed nation. However, Australia is a country without a Bill of Rights. Here, a federal parliament decides what rights to grant citizens and who will be protected by these rights. According to the Parliament of Australia, quote, "The prevailing view was that Australia did not need a Bill of Rights because basic freedoms were adequately protected by the common law and by the good sense of elected representatives." Now, let's think about this for a moment and look at some of the key words here. Regardless of any political views, does it ever make sense to put your rights in the hands of elected representatives? Even if you support your elected official, do you really want to give them the power to take away your rights? Should we place that much trust in politicians? Here is just one example of infringement upon the freedom of speech in Australia.
Federal governments have passed more than 70 pieces of legislation criminalising aspects of journalism. A Senate inquiry on this very issue continues in Canberra, but starting yesterday, the entire media industry is joining forces on a campaign to support the right of the public to know. You'll have seen this on the front pages of newspapers yesterday. Every front page was deliberately censored, as opposed to the caption, which said, "Your right to know." In other words, the front page was a metaphor of the problem. What information was crossed out? The inference is, when this happens, we're not smart enough or mature enough to digest such information. Successive governments of both persuasions have taken the view that they will determine what we have a right to know. And if you step out of line, government and its instrumentalities like the federal police will go after you.
Because Australians' rights are not specifically outlined in a founding document, the government has more freedom to control the public. Something like this would never occur in America because everyone is protected under the Constitution, not just the people in power. Our next point to cover is power and corruption. What does the American Constitution have to say about that? Well, our Constitution ensures that no one person can single-handedly change the American system. Our government is split up into 3 separate branches and filled with people from all across America with differing values and opinions. This forces us to communicate, share ideas, and create bipartisan solutions to issues facing the country. Now, although the separation of powers does lend itself to political squabbles, which can be annoying, frustrating, and even comical at times, debate is still vital to our nation's identity. We must have opposing views to balance power. Now, let's take a look at the Chinese method of balancing power. Well, there really isn't one. China is a single-party state, meaning that anything Chinese leadership says goes. In 2018, the Chinese people entered into a dictatorship when presidential term limits were abolished. President Xi Jinping and Chinese leadership can do whatever they want because they have full control over China. At that point, the Chinese citizens and their needs are just an afterthought. Let's recap. In America, our Constitution protects us from corrupt, power-hungry politicians because power is limited. However, in places like China, there are no limits on power, which has resulted in religious persecution, excessive surveillance, and even censorship. Next up, localized power. The American Constitution states that state governments should have greater power than the federal government, meaning that if you live in Indiana, someone from DC cannot control every aspect of your life. Every state has its own unique needs. That is why localized government works. What an ingenious idea, right? Well, sadly, many other countries do not agree with this. In places like Venezuela, there is one dictator who rules over everyone, and opposition is not tolerated. This nation is in an economic shambles and is in clear violation of human rights standards. According to Lawfare, quote, in the 1970s, Venezuela was among the richest countries in the world. It maintained a robust constitutional democracy with peaceful transfers of power. Yet only a few decades later, Venezuela suffers from a brutal dictatorship that has dismantled all democratic institutions. End quote. Power must be spread out. In America, we have a founding document that forces us to do this. Sadly, other countries are not as fortunate. In life, there are a lot of gray areas, like whether you should say thank you to a thank you note, or how you should react to someone who says they like pineapple on their pizza.
Ew.
Fortunately, this is not the case in our Constitution. Our rights are clearly outlined and do not change. Many countries have adopted versions of America's Constitution, but few truly provide free speech for citizens. On top of this, their rights are subject to change depending on who's in charge. Could you imagine having your rights in the hands of some elected official? This is the stark reality in many other countries. There are officials who would like to implement this into the American system of government. A living constitution would destroy our nation's principles, and we must fight against it. Finally, the U.S. Constitution establishes how to properly conduct elections in America. We use an electoral college. This way, the minority has a voice, and the presidential pick represents the entire country. If we shifted to a popular vote, places like California, New York, and Texas would dominate the vote. Political candidates would only visit these states, and every other state would lack representation. Selecting a leader using the popular vote may work for smaller countries, but it would destroy America. The American Constitution is at the heart of our nation's values. It protects us from greedy politicians looking for their next power grab, clearly outlines our rights, and proclaims that all Americans are equal regardless of status or position. Freedom is our guiding principle, and the Constitution is our how-to manual. Regardless of our political beliefs, the United States Constitution unites us all.